The metallic echo of laughter bounced off the concrete walls of Fort Valor's commissary as Sergeant Major Wade Crusher Grant pointed at 12-year-old Harper Spencer's carefully pressed camouflage uniform, his voice dripping with condescension as he declared to the gathered soldiers that little girls shouldn't play dress-up in dead people's clothes. What Grant didn't know was that those weren't costume fatigues. They belonged to Captain Sarah Angel Spencer, one of the Army's most decorated snipers before her death in Afghanistan 3 years ago. And her daughter had inherited far more than just clothing. When Harper quietly asked to demonstrate her shooting skills on Eagle's Peak Range, Grant's cruel amusement would transform into stunned silence as a child's impossible precision with a rifle shattered every assumption about talent, respect, and the true meaning of military legacy. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun casts long shadows across Fort Valor Army Base as Harper Spencer walked through the main gate beside her father, Ryan. At 12 years old, she carried herself with an unusual stillness that made her seem older, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation-style bun beneath a patrol cap that had been carefully adjusted to fit her small head. The digital camouflage uniform she wore was immaculate, every crease sharp enough to cut paper, every button polished to mirror brightness. Ryan Spencer glanced down at his daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. At 38, he bore the weathered look of a man who had seen too much in too few years. His janitor's uniform marked him as base maintenance personnel, but his bearings still carried traces of the Army Ranger he had once been before grief, and circumstances had reshaped his life into something smaller and more manageable. "Remember what we talked about, kiddo," Ryan said quietly as they approached the commissary where he needed to pick up supplies for his work detail. "Some people might not understand why you're wearing those." Harper's hand moved instinctively to touch the name tape sewn above her right breast pocket. Spencer below it, barely visible unless someone looked closely with the faded outlines where captain's bars had once been attached before they were carefully removed. "I understand, Dad, but she would have wanted me to wear them today." Today marked the 3rd anniversary of Captain Sarah Spencer's death, and Harper had insisted on honoring her mother's memory by wearing the uniform that had been folded in a triangle and presented with military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Ryan had initially resisted, knowing that seeing his daughter in military fatigues would trigger memories he worked hard to keep buried, but Harper's quiet determination had worn down his defenses. The Fort Valor commissary bustled with typical Monday morning activity as soldiers, their families, and civilian personnel moved through the aisles, gathering necessities. The building's fluorescent lighting reflected off polished floors and gleaming surfaces, creating an environment that felt both institutional and oddly homey. Harper followed her father toward the cleaning supply section, drawing curious glances from other patrons who weren't accustomed to seeing children in military uniform. Near the checkout area, a group of soldiers had gathered around Sergeant Major Wade Grant, who was regaling them with stories from his weekend fishing trip. At 45, Grant commanded attention through sheer physical presence and the kind of loud confidence that came from 20 years of military service. His broad shoulders and thick neck gave him the appearance of a man who had spent considerable time in base weight rooms, while his close-cropped gray hair and perpetual scowl suggested someone uncomfortable with anything that deviated from established order. So there I was fighting this monster base, Grant was saying, his voice carrying easily across the store, when my line snaps clean in half. 20... Test. And this fish just laughed at me. The soldiers around him chuckled appropriately, a mix of junior enlisted personnel and a few NCOs who understood the importance of laughing at their senior stories, regardless of their entertainment value. Among them stood Corporal Alex Morgan, a 24-year-old with an easy smile who had recently returned from deployment, and Private Sean Graham, 19, and still adjusting to military life after completing basic training just 6 months earlier. Grant's storytelling was interrupted when his gaze fell on Harper, who had wandered slightly away from her father to examine a display of military-themed merchandise near the front of the store. The sight of the small figure and perfectly fitted camouflage seemed to trigger something in Grant's expression, his features shifting from amiable storytelling mode to something harder and more critical. "Well, well," Grant said loudly enough to draw attention from other customers. "What do we have here?" Harper looked up from the display she had been studying, immediately recognizing the tone of voice that adults used when they were about to say something unpleasant. She had heard it often enough in the 3 years since her mother's death, usually from people who thought they knew better than a child what was appropriate behavior for someone her age. Grant approached with the deliberate stride of someone accustomed to intimidating subordinates, his combat boots clicking against the polished floor. "Sweetheart, you know it's not Halloween, right?" The question was clearly rhetorical, designed to embarrass rather than elicit an actual response. Harper felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained the kind of steady eye contact her mother had taught her was essential when facing down bullies. "No, sir. I know what day it is." "Then maybe you can explain to me why a little girl is running around my base playing dress-up in military uniform," Grant continued, his voice carrying the kind of parade ground authority that made nearby conversations fall silent. "You think this is some kind of game?" Ryan Spencer heard his daughter's voice and immediately abandoned his shopping to move toward the confrontation. But Harper's response came before he could intervene. "These aren't dress-up clothes, sir. This uniform belonged to my mother." Grant's expression showed no softening at this information. If anything, it seemed to harden further, as though Harper's connection to military service made her violation of unwritten protocols more serious rather than less. "Oh, really? And what was Mommy's job in the Army?" "Let me guess. Cook, supply clerk. Maybe she pushed papers around in some air-conditioned office." The casual dismissal of her mother's service hit Harper like a physical blow, but she maintained her composure with the kind of discipline that would have made any drill sergeant proud. "My mother was Captain Sarah Spencer. She was a sniper." This revelation drew murmurs from the soldiers who had gathered to watch Grant's performance, some recognizing the name from unit histories and others simply impressed by the gravity in Harper's voice. But Grant seemed determined to maintain his role as disciplinarian, regardless of the facts being presented. "Right?" he said with theatrical skepticism. "A sniper. And I suppose she was some kind of hero, too. Saved the world single-handedly." Before Harper could respond, Ryan Spencer reached the group with a kind of controlled urgency that suggested violence was being actively suppressed. "Sergeant Major," he said carefully, his voice carrying just enough edge to indicate that courtesy was being extended rather than naturally felt. "I think there might be some misunderstanding here." Grant turned his attention to Ryan, taking in the janitor's uniform and drawing immediate conclusions about social hierarchy and military status. No misunderstanding at all, Spencer. Your daughter is walking around in military uniform like she's playing soldier. That's disrespectful to everyone who's actually earned the right to wear it. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge, and Ryan found himself caught between the desire to protect his daughter and the practical reality that Grant's position on base could make their lives significantly more difficult if handled poorly. "Sir, that uniform belonged to my wife, Captain Sarah Spencer. She was killed in action in Afghanistan 3 years ago." "Killed in action," Grant repeated, his tone suggesting deep skepticism about this claim. Convenient story. Easy to say when there's no way to verify it. Corporal Morgan stepped forward slightly, his expression uncomfortable with the direction this confrontation was taking. "Sergeant Major, maybe we should." "Maybe you should mind your own business, Corporal," Grant snapped without taking his eyes off Harper. "This is about respect for military traditions and proper conduct on a military installation." Harper felt the weight of attention from everyone in the store, their conversations having stopped entirely as the confrontation escalated. She could see her father's hands clenching into fists and recognized the signs that his carefully controlled temper was approaching dangerous territory. In that moment, she made a decision that would change everything. "Sergeant Major Grant," she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence, "if you don't believe my mother earned the right to wear this uniform, I'd be happy to show you what she taught me." The offer was made with such calm sincerity that it took Grant a moment to process the implications. When understanding dawned, his expression shifted to something between amusement and outright mockery. "Oh, really? And what exactly did Mommy teach you? How to polish boots? How to make your bed with hospital corners?" "She taught me how to shoot," Harper replied simply. The statement was delivered without bravado or artificial drama. Just a straightforward acknowledgement of fact that somehow carried more weight than any amount of theatrical posturing could have achieved. Grant stared at her for several seconds, clearly trying to determine whether she was serious or simply trying to deflect his criticism through absurd claims. "You're telling me," Grant said slowly, "that a 12-year-old girl thinks she can shoot better than trained soldiers." "I'm not telling you." "I think anything," Harper corrected, with the kind of precision that suggested careful attention to language. "I'm offering to demonstrate what my mother taught me, if you're interested in seeing it." Ryan Spencer felt his heart sink as he recognized both the courage and the danger in his daughter's challenge. Harper had indeed inherited her mother's exceptional marksmanship abilities, but exposing those skills in this confrontational context could create complications he wasn't prepared to handle. "Harper, maybe this isn't the best time." "Actually," Grant interrupted, his voice taking on the cruel edge of someone who had identified an opportunity to make his point dramatically. "I think this is exactly the right time. If the little girl wants to play soldier, let's see what she's got." He turned to address the gathered soldiers, his tone becoming more theatrical as he sensed the entertainment value in what was about to unfold. "How about it, people? Anyone else curious to see what kind of training a 12-year-old got from her supposed sniper mother?" The invitation was clearly designed to humiliate Harper by exposing the gap between her childish fantasies and military reality. But Grant had fundamentally miscalculated both Harper's actual capabilities and the potential consequences of his public challenge. Private Graham looked uncomfortable with the entire situation, while Corporal Morgan seemed torn between loyalty to his senior NCO and growing uneasiness about the direction this was heading. "Eagle's Peak Range is open for training this morning," Grant continued, building momentum as he sensed the audience's engagement. "What do you say we take a little field trip? Give everyone a chance to see what kind of marksmanship gets passed down from fantasy soldiers to their little girls." Harper looked up at her father, seeing in his expression the same conflict that had defined much of their relationship since her mother's death. Ryan wanted to protect her from exactly this kind of public scrutiny, but he also understood that backing down now would validate every dismissive assumption Grant had made about their family's military legacy. "Dad," Harper said quietly, "it's okay. I want to do this." Ryan studied his daughter's face, seeing in her features the same determined expression that Sarah had worn when facing impossible odds in combat situations. The resemblance was so strong it made his chest tighten with grief and pride in equal measure. Finally, he nodded, slowly. "All right, Sergeant Major," Ryan said, his voice carrying a new edge that suggested Grant might want to reconsider his assumptions. "Let's go to the range." As the impromptu group began moving toward the commissary exit, Harper walked beside her father with a kind of calm focus that would have been remarkable in a trained soldier, let alone a child. She was about to demonstrate abilities that most people would find difficult to believe, but for Harper, it felt like coming home to something that had always been part of her identity. The morning sun grew stronger as they stepped outside, and Harper squinted slightly as her eyes adjusted to the brightness. In a few minutes, she would be standing on Eagle's Peak Range, with a rifle in her hands, finally given the opportunity to honor her mother's memory in the most meaningful way she knew how. Grant's laughter echoed across the parking lot as he regaled his followers with predictions about the upcoming humiliation he was about to deliver to the Spencer family. He had no idea that he was walking toward a demonstration that would fundamentally challenge everything he thought he knew about talent, respect, and the true meaning of military excellence. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Eagle's Peak shooting range sprawled across a natural valley between two rocky ridges. Its concrete firing positions and steel target frames creating geometric patterns against the wild Colorado landscape. The facility could accommodate everything from basic marksmanship training to advanced sniper courses with lanes extending from 25 millimeters out to an impressive 800 millimeters through the mountain terrain. Captain Jake Crosshair Mitchell was conducting routine maintenance on the range equipment when he spotted the unusual group approaching from the base parking area. At 35, Mitchell had spent the better part of a decade perfecting his own shooting skills and teaching others. But he had never seen Sergeant Major Grant bring civilians to the range for what appeared to be an impromptu demonstration. "Morning, Sergeant Major," Mitchell called out as the group reached the range control tower. His trained eye immediately cataloged the participants. Grant and several enlisted personnel he recognized. A maintenance worker whose bearing suggested former military service, and most surprisingly, a young girl in an impeccably fitted camouflage uniform. "Mitchell," Grant replied with the kind of expansive good humor that typically preceded something unpleasant. "We've got ourselves a special situation here. This little lady claims her mother was some kind of hotshot sniper and she wants to show us what she learned." Mitchell's expression grew more serious as he processed this information. Range safety was his primary responsibility, and the presence of a child introduced variables that weren't covered in standard operating procedures. "Sir, I'm not sure we have protocols for minors using military weapons on a training range." "Well, we're about to establish some new protocols," Grant said dismissively. "Unless you think a 12-year-old poses some kind of threat to range safety." The challenge in Grant's voice made it clear that questioning his judgment would be interpreted as a lack of confidence in his command authority. Mitchell found himself in the familiar position of having to choose between following regulations and avoiding conflict with a senior NCO whose displeasure could make life significantly more complicated. Harper stepped forward before Mitchell could respond, her voice carrying the kind of respectful formality that suggested familiarity with military customs. "Captain Mitchell, I understand your concerns about range safety. I've been trained in proper weapon handling and range procedures. I'd be happy to demonstrate my knowledge before touching any equipment." The offer surprised Mitchell, who was accustomed to dealing with soldiers who often needed extensive safety briefings before being trusted with weapons. The girl's mature approach to the situation suggested either exceptional training or an unusual understanding of military protocols. "What kind of training have you had?" Mitchell asked, his professional curiosity overriding his initial reluctance. "My mother started teaching me when I was 8. Harper replied simply. "Basic weapon safety, sight alignment, breathing techniques, trigger control. We practiced every weekend when she was stateside." Corporal Morgan had been listening to this exchange with growing unease about the direction events were taking. "Captain," he said carefully, "maybe we should verify some of this before proceeding." Grant turned on the young corporal with obvious irritation. "Verify what, exactly?" "The girl wants to shoot. We have a range available, and I'm curious to see what kind of nonsense she's been taught by her fantasy soldier mother." The casual dismissal of Harper's mother drew a reaction from Ryan Spencer, whose carefully maintained composure showed signs of strain. Sergeant Major Captain Sarah Spencer received the Silver Star for her actions in Afghanistan. Her service record speaks for itself. "Does it?" Grant replied with theatrical skepticism. "Because I've never heard of any female snipers earning Silver Stars. Sounds like the kind of story families tell themselves to make their losses seem more meaningful." The accusation hung in the mountain air like a challenge to everything the Spencer family held sacred about Sarah's memory and service. Mitchell found himself caught between his duty to maintain range safety and his growing discomfort with Grant's handling of what was clearly a sensitive family situation. Before the confrontation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the tension with unmistakable authority. "Is there a problem here, gentlemen?" Staff Sergeant Nina Sharp Price approached from the Advanced Marksmanship Training Building, her stride carrying the confident precision of someone accustomed to commanding respect in maladominated environments. At 32, Price had established herself as one of the Army's premier sniper instructors with combat experience that included 2 deployments to Afghanistan and a reputation for excellence that transcended gender boundaries. Price's arrival shifted the dynamic immediately as everyone present recognized her expertise and authority in matters related to marksmanship training. Her eyes moved quickly over the assembled group before settling on Harper with obvious professional interest. "Captain Spencer," Price said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard by the immediate group. "Angel 6, 2nd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment." The identification hit Ryan Spencer like an electric shock. confirming not only that Price had known his wife, but that she remembered Sarah's call sign and unit designation. Harper's eyes widened as she realized she was meeting someone who had actually served with her mother in combat. "You knew her," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew her," Price confirmed, her expression softening slightly as she studied Harper's features. "Best natural shooter I ever worked with could put 3 rounds through the same hole at 600 meters in a crosswind that would challenge most trained snipers." Grant's confident demeanor faltered slightly as Price's testimony contradicted his dismissive assumptions. "About Sarah Spencer's military service. Staff Sergeant, I wasn't aware you had served with supposed sniper personnel in Afghanistan." Supposed Price's voice carried a dangerous edge that made several soldiers take unconscious steps backward. "Sergeant Major Captain Spencer saved my life and the lives of 12 other Rangers during an ambush outside Kandahar. There was nothing supposed about her abilities or her service. The confirmation of Sarah's combat record from someone with Price's credentials fundamentally altered the context of the confrontation. Grant found himself in the uncomfortable position of having publicly questioned the service of a decorated war hero, while Harper felt validation for everything she had been taught to believe about her mother's legacy. "Well," Grant said, clearly struggling to maintain his dominant position in the conversation, "even if her mother was some kind of soldier, that doesn't mean the kid inherited any actual skills. Kids don't become marksmen just because their parents could shoot." Price studied Harper with the evaluating gaze of a professional instructor assessing potential talent. "How old were you when your mother started training you?" "8?" Harper replied. "She said marksmanship was like music, easier to learn when you start young, but you have to practice every day to maintain the skill." "What's the longest shot you've ever made?" Price asked, her tone suggesting genuine professional interest rather than skeptical challenge. Harper considered the question carefully before responding. 450 meters using Mom's rifle with iron sights. But that was 6 months ago, and I've grown since then, so my sight picture might be different now." The casual mention of making a 400-meter shot with iron sights drew sharp attention from everyone present who understood the technical difficulty of such an achievement. Mitchell found himself reassessing his initial assumptions about the girl's claimed abilities. "Staff Sergeant," Grant interjected, clearly uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, "surely you're not suggesting we allow a child to use military weapons based on unsupported claims about her training?" Price's response carried the weight of professional expertise and moral authority that Grant couldn't easily dismiss. "I'm suggesting that if Harper Spencer is half the shooter her mother was, we're looking at someone with exceptional natural ability that deserves respectful evaluation rather than public mockery." The rebuke was delivered with military courtesy but unmistakable firmness, putting Grant in the position of either backing down from his confrontational stance or escalating the conflict with someone whose combat credentials and professional reputation exceeded his own. "Fine," Grant said after a moment of calculation. "Let's see what the little girl can do. But when she embarrasses herself trying to handle weapons she's not trained for, I don't want to hear any excuses about how she would have done better with different equipment or conditions." Mitchell recognized that the situation had moved beyond his ability to control through normal safety protocols. "If we're going to do this, we'll need to follow modified procedures. I'll need to verify her basic weapon safety knowledge before allowing her to handle any firearms." "That's reasonable," Harper said, her calm acceptance of safety requirements further demonstrating the maturity that had surprised everyone present. What would you like me to demonstrate? For the next 15 minutes, Mitchell conducted an informal but thorough evaluation of Harper's knowledge of basic weapons safety, range procedures, and marksmanship fundamentals. Her responses revealed not only comprehensive understanding of technical concepts, but practical experience that went far beyond theoretical knowledge. Acceptable, Mitchell concluded, though his tone suggested the evaluation had exceeded his expectations significantly. We'll start with basic familiarization on a 25-meter range before considering longer distances. Price had been observing this evaluation with growing professional interest. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to observe Miss Spencer's demonstration. Her mother's training methods might provide insights valuable for our instructional programs." The request was perfectly reasonable from a professional development standpoint, but it also ensured that Harper would have an advocate present who understood both her family's military legacy and the technical aspects of advanced marksmanship. As the group moved toward the firing positions, Harper walked beside Price with obvious eagerness to learn more about her mother's service. "Staff Sergeant, what was she like in combat situations?" "Cool under pressure," Price replied without hesitation. "Never rushed a shot, never let emotions affect her judgment. She used to say that good shooting was 90% mental discipline and 10% technical skill." Grant overheard this exchange with obvious skepticism about the wisdom of building up a child's expectations before what he anticipated would be a humiliating failure. All this talk about mental discipline and technical skills sounds impressive, but shooting targets on a controlled range is completely different from actual combat situations. "You're right about that," Price agreed, though not in the way Grant had intended. "Combat shooting is much more difficult. Fortunately, we're starting with basic range work to evaluate fundamental skills." As they reached the firing line, Harper looked out across the range with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was already calculating distances, wind conditions, and sight adjustments. The morning sun had climbed higher in the Colorado sky, creating favorable lighting conditions for precision shooting. Mitchell began setting up targets at the 25-millimeter line, while Harper familiarized herself with the M4 carbine that would be used for the initial demonstration. Her handling of the weapon was smooth and confident, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that typically characterized first-time shooters. "Ready when you are, Miss Spencer," Mitchell announced after completing his target setup. Harper settled into a supported prone position with fluid economy of movement, her body alignment and weapon handling demonstrating hours of careful training and practice as she began her sight picture alignment. The casual conversations around the firing line gradually fell silent. Grant positioned himself where he could observe both Harper's shooting and the reactions of the other soldiers, anticipating the moment when reality would deflate the girl's pretensions and validate his assessment of the situation. He had no way of knowing that he was about to witness something that would challenge every assumption he had made about talent, training, and military excellence. The silence that settled over Eagle's Peak Range held the weight of expectation and disbelief as Harper Spencer adjusted her cheek weld against the M4 carbine stock. Through the rifle's iron sights, the target 25 meters down range appeared crisp and clear, its black bullseye standing out against the white background like a challenge waiting to be answered. "Take your time," Captain Mitchell said quietly from his position as range safety officer. "There's no rush." Harper's breathing had already settled into the controlled rhythm her mother had taught her. Inhale, exhale, halfway, hold, squeeze. The trigger press was smooth and deliberate, breaking cleanly with a kind of technique that typically required months of training to develop. The sharp crack of the rifle shot echoed off the surrounding ridges, followed immediately by the distinctive ping of a bullet striking steel. Through his binoculars, Mitchell observed the target with professional assessment before announcing his findings. Center mass. Good shot. Grant had positioned himself where he could watch both Harper's technique and the target results. Expecting to witness the kind of scattered grouping that would validate his assumptions about children playing with adult weapons, the single-centered hit was impressive, but hardly conclusive evidence of exceptional ability. Lucky shot, Grant declared, with confident dismissal. Anyone can get lucky once. Staff Sergeant Price stepped forward with the kind of calm authority that came from years of training elite marksmen. "Miss Spencer, would you be comfortable attempting a 5-round group?" "Yes, ma'am," Harper replied without lifting her eye from the sight picture. The formal address drew approving nods from the military personnel present, demonstrating respect for rank that went beyond surface politeness. What followed was a demonstration of marksmanship that silenced every skeptical comment and dismissive prediction. Harper's second shot struck within inches of the first, followed by 3 more rounds that created a grouping so tight it appeared to be a single enlarged hole in the target's center ring. Mitchell lowered his binoculars with an expression of professional amazement that he made no attempt to conceal. 5 rounds, approximately 1 in group at 25 mem. That's expert-level shooting by any standard. The announcement created ripples of conversation among the soldiers who had gathered to witness what they expected to be a child's embarrassing failure. Corporal Morgan found himself reconsidering every assumption he had made about Harper's capabilities, while Private Graham stared at the target display with the kind of awe typically reserved for watching professionals perform impossible feats. Grant's confident demeanor showed the first signs of uncertainty as he processed results that directly contradicted his expectations. Fine. She can hit a target at close range, but 25 mm isn't real shooting. Any recruit can be taught to hit targets when they're practically close enough to reach out and touch. Price turned toward Grant with the patient expression of an instructor dealing with a particularly stubborn student. "Sergeant Major, what distance would you consider appropriate for evaluating marksmanship skills?" The question was clearly a trap, but Grant's pride wouldn't allow him to back down from the challenge he had initiated. "Real soldiers qualify at 300 mems. If she's such a hot shot, let's see how she does at a distance where skill actually matters." Harper lifted her head from the rifle scope for the first time since beginning her demonstration, looking toward her father with a questioning expression that sought permission rather than validation. Ryan Spencer felt his throat tighten as he recognized in his daughter's face the same focused determination that had characterized Sarah's approach to impossible challenges. "Harper," Ryan said quietly, "you don't have to prove anything to anyone." "I know, Dad," she replied with the kind of gentle firmness that reminded him powerfully of her mother. "But I want to." Mitchell found himself in the uncomfortable position of facilitating a demonstration that was rapidly moving beyond standard safety protocols and into uncharted territory. "Miss Spencer, 300 men shooting requires different equipment and procedures. The targets are smaller, the sight adjustments are more complex, and environmental factors become much more significant." "I understand," Captain Harper said respectfully. "My mother taught me about range estimation, wind reading, and ballistic compensation. I'd like to try if you think it's safe." Price had been evaluating Harper's performance with a clinical assessment of someone whose job involved identifying exceptional talent and developing it to maximum potential. "Captain Mitchell, with your permission, I'd like to set up a 300-meter target and observe Miss Spencer's technique at extended range." The request carried sufficient professional weight that Mitchell felt obligated to accommodate it, despite his growing concerns about the irregular nature of the entire situation. "Very well, but we'll follow full long-range safety protocols, and Miss Spencer will need to demonstrate proper scope adjustment and range estimation before attempting any shots." As the group moved to the 300-meter firing position, Harper walked beside Price with obvious eagerness to learn from someone who had worked alongside her mother. "Staff Sergeant, did my mother ever talk about teaching me to shoot? She talked about you constantly," Price replied with a slight smile that transformed her typically serious expression. "She was incredibly proud of your natural ability, but she was also concerned about making sure you understood the responsibility that comes with exceptional skills." Grant overheard this exchange with mounting frustration about the way events were developing. What had begun as an opportunity to humiliate a presumptuous child was becoming a validation of everything he had sought to disprove about the Spencer family's military credentials. The 300-meter range stretched across a natural bowl in the mountainous terrain with target frames positioned at precise distances and marked with range indicators. The setup required more sophisticated equipment, including a scoped rifle and shooting rests that could accommodate the precision necessary for long-range work. Mitchell began configuring a bolt-action rifle equipped with a variable power scope, while explaining the additional complexities involved in extended-range shooting. At 300 m, bullet drop becomes significant. Wind drift can move your point of impact several inches, and minor errors in sight alignment are magnified dramatically. Harper listened to this briefing with the kind of attentive focus that suggested she was processing technical information rather than simply hearing words. When Mitchell finished his explanation, she asked questions that demonstrated both theoretical understanding and practical experience with the concepts being discussed. "What's the estimated wind speed at target distance?" she asked, studying the vegetation movement near the 300-meter line. Mitchell consulted his wind meter before responding. "Approximately 5 to 7 miles per hour left to right." Harper nodded thoughtfully, her gaze moving between the target and various environmental indicators that would affect bullet trajectory. "With the ammunition we're using, that should require about a 2-minute correction to the right, assuming standard atmospheric conditions." The casual precision of her ballistic calculation drew sharp attention from everyone present who possessed sufficient knowledge to evaluate its accuracy. Price exchanged a meaningful glance with Mitchell, both recognizing that Harper's technical understanding far exceeded what would be expected from casual training. "That's correct," Mitchell confirmed after running his own calculations. "How did you determine that so quickly?" "Mom made me practice ballistic math until I could do the calculations automatically," Harper explained simply. She said that in real situations, you don't always have time to work through the formulas step by step. Grant had been listening to this technical discussion with growing discomfort about the competence Harper was demonstrating in areas where he had expected ignorance and confusion. "All this theoretical knowledge is impressive, but shooting is about performance under pressure, not classroom mathematics." "You're absolutely right," Harper agreed pleasantly, settling into position behind the scoped rifle with movements that demonstrated familiarity with precision equipment. "Theory only matters if you can apply it consistently. The transition from standing conversation to shooting position was fluid and professional, showing none of the awkwardness or hesitation that typically characterized inexperienced shooters working with unfamiliar equipment. Harper's body alignment, stock placement, and scope positioning reflected hours of careful training and muscle memory development. As she began her sight picture alignment, the conversations around the firing line gradually diminished until the only sounds were wind rustling through mountain vegetation and the distant calls of birds circling above the ridges. The target at 300 Nallersme appeared smaller than a dinner plate through the rifle scope, its scoring rings barely visible even with magnification. Harper's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that preceded precision shooting. Her entire being focused on the complex coordination of sight alignment, trigger control, and environmental compensation that separated amateur shooting from professional marksmanship. The morning sun had climbed higher in the Colorado sky, creating favorable lighting conditions, but also introducing thermal effects that could influence bullet trajectory. "Ready when you are," Mitchell announced after completing his safety checks and target verification. The shot that followed was preceded by several seconds of absolute stillness, as Harper made final adjustments to her sight picture and breathing. When the rifle fired, the sound seemed sharper and more authoritative than the previous demonstration, as though the weapon itself recognized the precision being demanded of it. Through his spotting scope, Mitchell tracked the bullet's path to the target with professional interest that quickly transformed into amazement. Dead center bullseye, approximate distance from point of aim less than 1 inch. The announcement created a moment of stunned silence as the implications of Harper's performance settled over the assembled group. Private Graham looked between the target and Harper with an expression that suggested he was witnessing something that challenged his understanding of what was possible. While Corporal Morgan found himself reconsidering every assumption he had made about civilian versus military capabilities, Grant stared at the target through his own binoculars, desperately seeking some explanation for results that contradicted everything he had expected to observe. One shot doesn't prove anything. Anybody can get lucky with the right equipment. Price's response carried the quiet authority of someone whose expertise was beyond question. "Sergeant Major, that wasn't luck. That was exceptional marksmanship skill applied under controlled conditions." "Prove it," Grant snapped, his frustration finally overriding his professional composure. "Is she so good? Let her do it again." Harper looked up from the rifle scope with an expression of calm acceptance that suggested she had expected this challenge. "How many shots would you like me to fire, Sergeant Major?" The question was asked with such straightforward sincerity that it took Grant several seconds to formulate a response that would satisfy his need to find some flaw in Harper's performance. 5 shots. If you're really as good as you claim, you should be able to repeat that performance consistently." "I understand," Harper replied, settling back into position with movements that had become increasingly fluid and confident as the demonstration progressed. What followed was a display of precision shooting that exceeded even Price's expectations, based on her knowledge of Harper's mother's capabilities. Each shot struck within the target's center ring, creating a grouping so tight that spotting individual bullet holes required careful examination through high-powered optics. When Mitchell announced the final results, his voice carried a note of professional reverence, typically reserved for witnessing genuinely exceptional performance. 5 rounds, total group size approximately 2 in at 300 mm. That represents shooting at the level of advanced sniper training. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and uncomfortable, as everyone present processed the reality that they had just witnessed a 12-year-old girl demonstrate marksmanship skills that exceeded those of most trained soldiers. Grant found himself confronting the complete collapse of every assumption he had made about Harper's abilities and her family's military credentials. The aftermath of Harper's demonstration created an uncomfortable vacuum of silence that stretched across Eagle's Peak Range like a challenge, waiting to be acknowledged. Sergeant Major Grant stood motionless behind his binoculars, his jaw working silently as he processed results that had demolished every competent prediction he had made about the morning's outcome. Colonel Ann Warrior Phillips had arrived at the range during Harper's final shots, drawn by reports of unusual activity involving civilian personnel and weapons training. At 48, Phillips commanded Fort Valor with the kind of balanced authority that came from combat experience, administrative competence, and an intuitive understanding of when situations required command intervention rather than delegation. "Captain Mitchell," Phillips said as she approached the firing line, her tone carrying the neutral professionalism that preceded either combination or serious consequences. "I understand we have an irregular training situation developing here." Mitchell snapped to attention with the reflexive precision of someone whose career depended on maintaining proper military courtesy. "Yes, ma'am. We've been observing a marksmanship demonstration by Miss Harper Spencer, daughter of the late Captain Sarah Spencer." Phillips' expression shifted subtly as she processed this information, her military memory immediately connecting the Spencer name with unit histories and casualty reports from Afghanistan operations. "Captain Spencer, 2nd Battalion, 75th Rangers, Silver Star recipient." The confirmation from the base commander carried additional weight that finally penetrated Grant's defensive skepticism about Sarah Spencer's service record. Phillips' knowledge of specific unit designations and decorations indicated that Sarah's combat reputation extended beyond local legend into official military recognition. Colonel Staff Sergeant Price stepped forward with respectful formality. "Miss Spencer has just completed a 5-round group at 300M that meets advanced sniper qualification standards. Her technique and consistency indicate exceptional training and natural ability." Phillips studied Harper, who remained in shooting position with a kind of disciplined stillness that suggested she understood the significance of having the base commander observe her performance. "Miss Spencer, I'd like to speak with you, privately. Captain Mitchell, secure the range and ensure all equipment is properly stored." As the other personnel began clearing equipment and targets, Phillips gestured for Harper and Ryan to follow her toward the range control building. Grant hesitated for a moment before stepping forward with obvious reluctance to involve himself in what had become a command-level situation. "Colonel Phillips," Grant said carefully, "I believe there may be some security and safety considerations regarding civilian access to military training facilities that should be addressed." Phillips turned toward Grant with the kind of measuring gaze that experienced officers used when evaluating subordinates who might be exceeding their authority. "Sergeant Major, are you suggesting that you initiated this demonstration without considering security implications?" The question was designed to place responsibility for the morning's events squarely on Grant's shoulders, forcing him to defend decisions that he now realized might be difficult to justify through official channels. "Ma'am, The situation developed organically from a discussion about military traditions and respect for uniform standards. I see. Phillips replied with the kind of neutral tone that typically preceded uncomfortable conversations about judgment and leadership. We'll discuss your role in these events later. Right now, I'm more interested in understanding Miss Spencer's background and capabilities. Inside the range control building, Phillips settled behind Captain Mitchell's desk, while Harper and Ryan took seats in the utilitarian metal chairs, typically reserved for safety briefings at administrative meetings. The afternoon sun streamed through windows that offered panoramic views of the shooting ranges and mountain terrain beyond. Harper, Phillips began using the girl's first name to establish a less formal atmosphere. That was remarkable shooting. Your mother would have been proud. Thank you, ma'am, Harper replied quietly, her hands folded in her lap with a kind of disciplined posture that suggested familiarity with military customs and courtesies. I've been trying to honor her memory by maintaining the skills she taught me. Phillips leaned forward slightly, her expression reflecting genuine interest rather than bureaucratic obligation. Tell me about your training. How often do you practice and where? Harper glanced toward her father before responding, seeking permission to discuss activities that had been kept private from official scrutiny. Ryan nodded encouragingly, recognizing that secrecy was no longer an option given the morning's public demonstration. We have access to a civilian range about 20 miles from Copper Falls, Harper explained. Dad takes me there every weekend when his work schedule allows. I practice with different rifles and distances, trying to maintain the standards Mom set for me. What kind of standards? Phillips asked, with the detailed interest of someone evaluating potential, rather than simply gathering information. Harper's response revealed the comprehensive nature of her training and the ambitious goals her mother had established for her development. Mom said, I should be able to hit a man-sized target at 400 millimeters under field conditions regardless of weather or equipment variables. She wanted me to understand that marksmanship is a responsibility, not just a skill. The maturity implicit in Harper's understanding of ethical obligations impressed Phillips, who had seen too many soldiers struggle with the moral complexity of using lethal skills in appropriate contexts. Your mother was wise to emphasize responsibility along with technique. Ryan Spencer had been listening to this conversation with mounting anxiety about the institutional attention Harper's abilities were attracting. Colonel, I hope you understand that we've kept Harper's training private specifically to avoid creating complications or unrealistic expectations about her future. Phillips nodded with understanding that reflected her own experience balancing military obligations with family considerations. Mr. Spencer, I appreciate your protective instincts, but Harper's demonstrated abilities raise questions that go beyond family privacy. Before Ryan could ask for clarification, Phillips continued with the kind of direct communication that military leaders used when discussing significant opportunities or challenges. The Army has programs for identifying and developing exceptional talent, particularly in specialized skills that are difficult to teach and harder to master. What kind of programs? Harper asked, her voice carrying the first hint of excitement she had shown since the morning's confrontations began. Advanced marksmanship training, competitive shooting teams, and eventually specialized military occupational specialties that utilize precision shooting skills. Phillips explained, these opportunities are typically reserved for active duty personnel, but there are precedents for civilian involvement in development programs. The possibilities Phillips was describing represented everything Harper had dreamed of, but never dared to request directly. The chance to receive formal training, access to advanced equipment, and recognition for abilities that had been developed in isolation seemed almost too significant to believe. Colonel Ryan said carefully, "Harper is 12 years old. I'm not comfortable with military programs that might accelerate her involvement in activities she's not emotionally ready to handle." Phillips' response reflected both respect for parental authority and recognition of exceptional circumstances that required creative solutions. "Mr. Spencer, I'm not suggesting immediate military enlistment or adult responsibilities. I'm talking about mentorship programs that would develop Harper's abilities while ensuring appropriate educational and emotional support." Before Ryan could respond, the conversation was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door, followed by the entrance of Master Sergeant Kyle Solid Stewart, whose expression suggested urgent business that couldn't wait for conventional scheduling. Colonel Stewart said with respectful urgency, "We've received notification that Lieutenant General Bailey is en route to the base for an unscheduled inspection. Her helicopter is expected within the hour." Phillips felt her stomach tighten as she processed the implications of an unexpected visit from Pentagon-level authority. Unscheduled inspections typically indicated either serious problems requiring immediate attention or significant opportunities that demanded command-level evaluation. "Did they specify the purpose of the visit?" Phillips asked, though she suspected the answer would provide little useful information. "Negative, ma'am," Stewart replied. "Just notification of arrival and a request for immediate briefing upon landing." Phillips looked between Harper and Ryan, recognizing that the morning's events had created a situation that would now receive scrutiny from the highest levels of military authority. "Mr. Spencer Harper, it appears our conversation will need to continue later. I have a feeling that today's demonstration will be of considerable interest to our visiting general." As the group prepared to leave the range control building, Harper gathered her thoughts about a morning that had begun with public humiliation and was concluding with possibilities she had never imagined. The silver name tape on her uniform seemed to carry additional weight as she realized that her mother's legacy was becoming intertwined with her own developing path. Outside, Sergeant Major Grant waited with obvious anxiety about how the morning's events would be characterized in official reports and command briefings. His confident dismissal of Harper's abilities had been completely undermined by her performance, leaving him in the uncomfortable position of having to explain why he had publicly challenged a child whose skills exceeded those of most trained soldiers. "Sergeant Major," Phillips said as they emerged from the building, "I'll want a detailed written report about this morning's activities on my desk within 2 hours. Include your assessment of the training value and any recommendations for follow-up actions." Grant's expression showed recognition that his report would need to carefully balance honesty about Harper's exceptional abilities with explanations for his own confrontational approach to the situation. "Yes, ma'am." "Will there be any specific areas you'd like me to emphasize? Focus on facts and observations rather than personal opinions," Phillips replied, with the kind of pointed guidance that suggested Grant's previous judgments had been noted and found wanting. "I'm particularly interested in your professional assessment of Miss Spencer's marksmanship capabilities and training background." As the group dispersed across the base to prepare for Lieutenant General Bailey's unexpected arrival, Harper walked beside her father with a mixture of excitement and apprehension about the attention her abilities were attracting from increasingly senior military officials. "Dad," she said quietly as they approached their truck, "do you think Mom would approve of what happened today?" Ryan considered the question carefully before responding, recognizing that his answer would influence how Harper understood the significance of her public demonstration. "Kiddo, your mother believed that exceptional abilities came with obligations to use them properly. Today, you honored her memory and proved that her training wasn't wasted." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Valor as word of Harper's demonstrations spread through unofficial channels, creating conversations and questions that would soon reach the attention of decision-makers, whose response would determine whether the Spencer family's morning of confrontation and vindication was the end of their story, or merely the beginning of something much larger and more complex than either of them had anticipated. The steady thrum of helicopter rotors announced Lieutenant General Joan Storm Bailey's arrival 45 minutes ahead of schedule, catching Fort Valor's command staff in various stages of preparation for an inspection that had materialized without warning or explanation. Colonel Phillips stood at the helicopter landing zone with a kind of rigid attention that reflected both respect for superior authority and anxiety about the timing of this unscheduled visit. Bailey's helicopter touched down with military precision, its downwash creating swirling clouds of dust and debris that scattered across the tarmac like a meteorological warning of the changes about to sweep through the base. At 65, Bailey commanded attention through sheer presence rather than physical intimidation, her silver hair and weathered features reflecting 4 decades of military service that had taken her from second lieutenant to the Pentagon's inner circles. "Colonel Phillips," Bailey said as she stepped onto the tarmac, her voice carrying easily over the diminishing rotor noise. "I apologize for the short notice, but I received some interesting reports about activities at your facility that required immediate investigation." Phillips felt her anxiety intensify as she processed the implications of Bailey's statement. Pentagon-level officials didn't make unscheduled cross-country flights to investigate routine base activities, which meant that Harper's demonstration had somehow generated attention at the highest levels of military command. "General, we're prepared to brief you on any aspects of base operations that require your attention," Phillips replied with the kind of careful neutrality that avoided committing to specific topics until she understood the scope of Bailey's interests. Bailey's expression remained professionally unreadable as she gestured toward the waiting staff car. "Colonel, I'm specifically interested in reports of exceptional marksmanship demonstrated by a civilian miner on your training ranges. The details I received were remarkable. The confirmation that Bailey's visit related directly to Harper's performance created a new level of complexity that Phillips hadn't anticipated. Military communications channels typically filtered information through multiple layers before reaching general officer attention, which meant that someone with considerable influence had taken specific interest in the morning's events. As they drove toward the base headquarters building, Bailey continued her preliminary questioning with the kind of systematic approach that characterized her rise through military intelligence and strategic planning roles. "Colonel, what can you tell me about the Spencer family's connection to this installation?" Phillips recognized the careful phrasing that suggested Bailey possessed background information she wasn't yet revealing. "General Ryan Spencer works as a maintenance contractor on base. His daughter Harper has been living in base housing since her mother's death 3 years ago." "Captain Sarah Spencer," Bay said quietly. though whether the statement reflected prior knowledge or recent research wasn't immediately clear. 75th Rangers, Silver Star recipient, killed in action, Afghanistan, 2021. The specific details Bailey provided about Sarah's service indicated preparation that went beyond casual interest in base personnel matters. Phillips found herself wondering whether Bailey's investigation into the Spencer family had begun before or after reports of Harper's shooting demonstration reached Pentagon attention. They arrived at the headquarters building to find an unusual level of activity for a Monday afternoon, with staff officers moving between offices and conference rooms in response to the unexpected general officer visit. Major Derek Stryker Powell intercepted them at the entrance with a briefing folder and the kind of nervous efficiency that characterized responses to unplanned inspections. "General Bailey," Powell said with crisp formality, "we've prepared preliminary briefing materials on the morning's activities at Eagles Peak Range, including witness statements and performance documentation." Bailey accepted the folder without immediately opening it, her attention focused on assessing the institutional response to her arrival rather than diving into paperwork that might bias her evaluation of the situation. "Major, I'd like to speak with the individuals directly involved before reviewing written reports, starting with Miss Spencer and her father." The request for immediate access to civilian personnel created logistical challenges that Powell hadn't anticipated, but he recognized the futility of suggesting alternative procedures to a general officer who had traveled cross-country for this specific purpose. "Yes, ma'am. They're currently at their residence in base housing. I can have them here within 15 minutes. "Make it happen," Bailey said with the kind of quiet authority that made extended discussion unnecessary. As Powell departed to arrange the Spencer family's summons, Phillips found herself alone with Bailey for the first time since the general's arrival. The opportunity for private conversation felt both necessary and dangerous. Given the unclear motivations behind this high scrutiny, General Phillips said carefully, "May I ask what specific aspects of this morning's events drew Pentagon attention?" Bailey's response revealed information that fundamentally altered Phillips's understanding of the situation's significance. "Colonel, the Army has been conducting a classified evaluation of marksmanship training programs and talent identification procedures. When reports reached us about a 12-year-old civilian demonstrating sniper-level accuracy, it triggered protocols that require immediate investigation." The mention of classified evaluation programs explained Bailey's rapid response, but raised new questions about the broader implications of Harper's demonstration. Phillips realized that what had seemed like an isolated incident involving family pride and institutional prejudice was actually intersecting with systematic military planning at levels far above base command authority. "Are we talking about recruitment programs or research initiatives?" Phillips asked, recognizing that the distinction would significantly affect how Harper's situation should be handled. "Both," Bailey replied with characteristic directness. "The Army is facing challenges in identifying and developing specialized skills that can't be easily taught through conventional training. Natural marksmanship ability of the level Miss Spencer apparently possesses represents a strategic asset that deserves careful evaluation." Before Phillips could process the full implications of this statement, Major Powell returned with notification that the Spencer family was en route to headquarters. "General, they'll be here in approximately 10 minutes. I've also prepared a conference room for your interviews." Bailey nodded acknowledgement while continuing her preliminary assessment of the institutional factors surrounding Harper's situation. Major, I want complete background files on all personnel involved in this morning's activities. Include service records, evaluation reports, and any disciplinary actions or commendations from the past 12 months. The comprehensive scope of Bailey's investigation indicated that she was evaluating not just Harper's abilities, but the entire command, climate, and decision-making process that had led to the morning's confrontation and demonstration. Phillips realized that Sergeant Major Grant's handling of the situation would receive scrutiny that could affect his career trajectory significantly. When Harper and Ryan arrived at headquarters, they found themselves entering an environment that had been transformed from routine administrative space into the focal point of high-level military attention. Harper wore the same immaculate camouflage uniform that had triggered the morning's confrontation, but her bearing showed signs of the confidence that came from proving herself under challenging circumstances. Bailey studied Harper with the evaluating gaze of someone trained to assess human capabilities and potential under various conditions. The girl's composure in the face of general officer attention impressed Bailey, who had observed many adult soldiers struggle with far less intimidating situations. "Miss Spencer," Bailey said as they entered the conference room, "I've traveled from Washington specifically to discuss your demonstration this morning. I understand it was quite remarkable." Harper's response reflected both respect for authority and growing comfort with discussing her abilities in professional contexts. "Yes, ma'am. I was honored to have the opportunity to show what my mother taught me." Bailey's expression softened slightly at the mention of Harper's mother, suggesting personal rather than purely professional interest in Sarah Spencer's legacy. "Your mother was an exceptional soldier, Harper. Her service record indicates the kind of dedication and skill that the Army values highly." "Thank you, General," Harper replied simply, though her voice carried emotional weight that indicated how much official recognition of her mother's service meant to her. Ryan Spencer had been observing this exchange with mounting concern about the level of attention Harper was receiving from senior military officials. "General Bailey, while we appreciate the Army's interest in Harper's abilities, she's still a child with educational and emotional needs that have to be considered." Bailey turned toward Ryan with understanding that reflected her own experience balancing military obligations with family considerations. "Mr. Spencer, I completely agree that Harper's age and development must be primary factors in any discussions about her future. However, her demonstrated capabilities raise questions that extend beyond normal talent identification procedures." Before Ryan could ask for clarification, Bailey continued with information that would fundamentally alter their understanding of Harper's situation and family history. "Mr. Spencer, there are aspects of your family's military connections that you may not be aware of. Connections that make Harper's abilities more significant than you might realize." The statement hung in the conference room air like a revelation waiting to be fully revealed, creating tension that both Harper and Ryan could feel, but neither fully understood. Bailey's careful phrasing suggested knowledge that went beyond standard personnel records and into areas of family history that had been kept private or hidden. "General," Ryan said slowly, "I'm not sure what you mean by connections I'm not aware of." Bailey opened the briefing folder she had received from Major Powell, extracting documents that appeared to contain genealogical information and military service records, extending back multiple generations. "Mr. Spencer, Your wife's family has a military tradition that spans 4 generations, including service in specialized units that have contributed significantly to Army marksmanship programs. Harper leaned forward with obvious interest as Bailey revealed information about family history that no one had ever discussed with her. General, what kind of specialized units, scout snipers, competitive shooting teams, and training development programs? Bailey replied, studying Harper's reaction to this revelation. Your mother's abilities weren't just individual talent, Harper. They represented the continuation of a family tradition that the Army has valued for decades. The information was overwhelming in its implications for how Harper understood both her own abilities and her place within military culture. Rather than being an isolated case of exceptional talent, she was apparently part of a multi-generational pattern of service that connected her to institutional history in ways she had never imagined. As Bailey continued revealing details about the Spencer family's military heritage, Harper felt the weight of expectation and opportunity settling on her shoulders like a mantle that had been waiting for her to grow into it. The morning's confrontation with Sergeant Major Grard suddenly seemed like a small prelude to decisions and challenges that would define not just her own future, but the continuation of a legacy that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. Lieutenant General Bailey closed the briefing folder with deliberate precision, her weathered hands betraying a slight tremor that suggested the weight of information she was about to reveal extended beyond professional interest into deeply personal territory. The conference room felt smaller as silence stretched between the 3 occupants, each processing the implications of family histories that were apparently more complex than anyone had realized. "Harper," Bailey said quietly, her voice carrying a different quality than the authoritative tone she had maintained throughout the official portions of their conversation. "There's something else you need to know about your family's military service, something that your father may not be aware of either." Ryan Spencer felt his chest tightened with a familiar anxiety that accompanied revelations about Sarah's past. Experiences that had often been classified beyond his security clearance and understanding. "General Sarah and I shared everything important about our lives and service. I can't imagine what family information I wouldn't know." Bayale's expression showed the kind of careful compassion that senior officers learned when delivering news that would fundamentally alter someone's understanding of their own history. "Mr. Spencer, your wife never knew this information either. It was classified at levels that prevented disclosure even to immediate family members." Harper found herself leaning forward with anticipation that mixed excitement about learning new aspects of her mother's legacy with apprehension about secrets that had been deemed too sensitive for family knowledge. "General, what kind of classified information? Your mother's exceptional marksmanship abilities weren't coincidental." "Harper." Bailey began extracting a photograph from her briefing materials that showed a woman in military uniform whose facial features bore an unmistakable resemblance to both Sarah and Harper. They were inherited from her mother, who served in specialized reconnaissance units during operations that remain classified to this day. The photograph hit Harper like a physical blow as she recognized facial structure and expressions that seemed familiar. Despite never having seen this image before, the woman in the picture wore insignia and decorations that indicated service at the highest levels of military special operations. But more importantly, she held a rifle with the same natural ease that Harper had observed in her mother's service photographs. "That's my grandmother?" Harper asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chief Warrant Officer Margaret Spencer," Bailey confirmed. studying Harper's reaction to this revelation. One of the Army's first female special operations personnel, serving in units that didn't officially exist during her era of service. Ryan stared at the photograph with growing confusion about family history that Sarah had never mentioned, despite their years of marriage and shared military service. General Sarah told me her parents died when she was young. She grew up in foster care. Bailey's expression grew more complex as she prepared to reveal information that would explain decades of family separation and institutional secrecy. Mr. Spencer, Chief Spencer, didn't die. She was reported killed in action to protect the classified nature of her actual assignment. She's been serving under deep cover identities for the past 30 years. The revelation was so unexpected and comprehensive that both Harper and Ryan sat in stunned silence as they processed implications that extended far beyond family reunions into questions about institutional loyalty, personal sacrifice, and the prices that military families paid for national security. "She's alive?" Harper finally managed to ask, her voice carrying a mixture of hope and confusion about why a living grandmother had been kept secret from her entire family. "She's alive," Bailey confirmed, "and currently serving in a position that brought her into contact with reports of your demonstration this morning." Before Harper could formulate questions about this impossible coincidence, Bailey continued with information that would explain the true scope of the morning's events and their significance beyond base-level personnel matters. Harper Chief Spencer is currently assigned to the Pentagon unit responsible for evaluating exceptional talent and developing specialized training programs. When reports of your marksmanship demonstration reached our attention, she was the officer assigned to investigate. Ryan felt reality shifting around him as he understood that the morning's confrontation with Sergeant Major Grant had somehow triggered a family reunion that had been prevented by decades of military classification and operational security. "General, are you saying that Sarah's mother has been alive all these years and working in the same organization where reports of Harper's shooting would naturally be reviewed?" "That's exactly what I'm saying," Bailey replied, with the kind of directness that military officers used when facts became too complex for diplomatic language. "Chief Spencer has been monitoring your family's welfare from a distance, unable to establish contact due to security protocols, but maintaining awareness of major life events. Harper struggled to process the emotional complexity of learning that she had a living grandmother who had been forced to remain hidden due to military obligations that transcended normal family relationships." "Does she know about me? About what happened to Mom?" Bailey's expression softened with genuine emotion as she prepared to deliver information that would provide both comfort and additional complexity to Harper's understanding of her family's situation. "Harper Chief Spencer has been following your development since your birth. She was unofficially present at your mother's funeral, though security requirements prevented her from identifying herself to the family. The image of a hidden grandmother watching her mother's burial from a distance while being unable to comfort her own granddaughter created an emotional impact that Harper found difficult to process. The intersection of family love with institutional obligations represented sacrifices that went beyond anything she had previously understood about military service. "Mr. Spencer," Bailey continued, turning her attention to Ryan's obvious struggle with these revelations, "Chief Spencer has been instrumental in ensuring that your family received appropriate survivor benefits and support services, though her involvement had to remain invisible for security reasons." Ryan found himself reconsidering every aspect of his family's post-military life, as he realized that anonymous assistance and favorable circumstances might have been the result of grandmother's hidden intervention rather than bureaucratic efficiency or simple good fortune. General Ryan said carefully, "If Chief Spencer has been monitoring our situation, then she knows about the financial struggles we've faced and Harper's educational challenges." "She knows everything," Bailey confirmed, including Harper's weekend visits to civilian shooting ranges and her systematic development of marksmanship skills that have now reached levels that trigger institutional attention. The comprehensive scope of surveillance and concern that Chief Spencer had maintained over her family's welfare impressed Harper while simultaneously raising questions about privacy and the boundaries between professional duty and personal relationships. "Can I meet her?" Harper asked, with a directness that had characterized her approach to challenging situations throughout the morning. Bailey's eye response revealed the complexity of security protocols that govern deep cover operations and family relationships within classified programs. Harper, Chief Spencer, is currently en route to Fort Valor. She received authorization to break cover specifically to meet you and evaluate your situation personally. The announcement that Harper would soon meet the grandmother she had never known existed, created excitement that was tempered by anxiety about the emotional complexity of such an encounter. Meeting family members under normal circumstances was challenging enough without the added factors of decades of separation and classified military obligations. "When will she arrive?" Ryan asked, recognizing that he would need time to prepare both himself and Harper for a reunion that would fundamentally alter their understanding of family history and military legacy. "Within the hour," Bailey replied, checking her watch with the kind of precision that suggested carefully coordinated timing rather than coincidental scheduling. "Chief Spencer's helicopter is approximately 30 minutes out from Fort Valor." As if responding to Bailey's announcement, the conference room door opened to admit Major Powell, whose expression indicated developments that required immediate command attention. "General, we've received notification of an incoming helicopter carrying Pentagon personnel with priority clearance. ETA 25 minutes, Bailey nodded acknowledgement, while maintaining her focus on preparing Harper and Ryan for an encounter that would test every assumption they had developed about family relationships and military service. Harper meeting Chief Spencer will be overwhelming, but I want you to understand that her career choices were driven by service to country rather than lack of concern for family. Harper absorbed this guidance while contemplating the prospect of meeting a grandmother whose life had been shaped by obligations that prevented normal family relationships. "General, will she be able to tell us about the classified work that kept her away from our family?" "Some of it," Bailey replied carefully. "Chief Spencer's current assignment involves developing training programs that could benefit from your demonstrated abilities. Your meeting will include professional evaluation along with personal reunion. The combination of family reconnection with institutional assessment added layers of complexity that Harper found both exciting and intimidating. Meeting her grandmother would fulfill emotional needs she hadn't even realized existed, while being evaluated for military programs represented opportunities that exceeded her most ambitious dreams. Ryan struggled with protective instincts that conflicted with recognition that Harper's abilities and family connections had created opportunities that couldn't be ignored or postponed. "General, I want Harper to meet her grandmother, but I'm concerned about the pressure of combining family reunion with professional evaluation." Bailey's response reflected understanding of parental concerns balanced against institutional needs and exceptional circumstances that required flexible approaches to normal procedures. "Mr. Spencer," Chief Spencer is coming here primarily as Harper's grandmother. The professional aspects of this meeting will be secondary to family relationships. As they prepared to leave the conference room to await Chief Spencer's arrival, Harper touched the silver name tape on her uniform with new understanding of the military tradition it represented. Learning that her exceptional abilities connected her not just to her mother's legacy, but to a multi-generational pattern of service, created both pride and responsibility that extended far beyond individual achievement. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Valor as word of the incoming Pentagon helicopter spread through unofficial channels, creating speculation and curiosity among base personnel who recognized that unscheduled high-level visits typically indicated either significant problems or exceptional opportunities. Harper walked beside her father toward the helicopter landing zone with anticipation that mixed excitement about meeting family with apprehension about the institutional attention her abilities were attracting from the highest levels of military command. The morning's confrontation with Sergeant Major Grant seemed like ancient history compared to the family reunion and professional evaluation that awaited her in the next few minutes. As they reached the landing zone, the distinctive sound of approaching helicopter rotors announced the arrival of Chief Spencer, whose presence would transform Harper's understanding of family, military service, and the complex relationships between personal identity and institutional obligations that defined life in the military community. The helicopter that descended toward Fort Valor's landing zone carried markings that indicated Pentagon Special Operations Command. But Harper's attention focused entirely on the approaching reunion with a grandmother whose existence had been hidden from her family for 3 decades. Standing beside Lieutenant General Bailey and her father, Harper felt the weight of anticipation mixed with nervous energy that made her hands tremble slightly as the aircraft's rotors created swirling dust clouds across the tarmac. When the helicopter's engines wound down and the passenger door opened, the woman who emerged moved with the kind of controlled precision that spoke to decades of military discipline and physical conditioning. Chief Warrant Officer Margaret Spencer appeared younger than her 62 years, her silver hair cut in a regulation style that framed features Harper immediately recognized as variations of her own reflection. The family resemblance was unmistakable, creating an emotional impact that hit Harper like recognition of something that had always been missing from her life. Margaret's gaze found Harper immediately among the small group waiting at the landing zone, her expression shifting from professional composure to something far more vulnerable as she studied the granddaughter she was meeting for the first time. For several seconds, neither moved, both processing the reality of a moment that had been impossible due to security classifications and operational requirements that superseded family relationships. "Harper," Margaret said quietly as she approached, her voice carrying decades of suppressed emotion and carefully maintained distance. "You look exactly like your mother did at your age." Harper found herself unable to speak as she studied this woman whose existence had been kept secret but whose influence had apparently shaped her family's circumstances in ways they had never understood. The silver wings on Harper's uniform seemed to catch Margaret's attention immediately, creating a visual connection between generations of military service that bridged the gap between strangers and family. Grandmother Harper finally managed, testing the unfamiliar word that carried emotional weight. She hadn't expected, "I thought you were dead." Margaret's expression showed the pain that came with acknowledging choices that had required her to remain absent from the most important moments in her family's life. "I know, sweetheart. That was necessary to protect both you and the missions I was assigned to complete. Ryan Spencer watched this reunion with conflicting emotions that ranged from joy at Harper's opportunity to meet family to anger about decades of deception that had deprived his daughter of grandmother's love and support during the most difficult period of her young life. "Chief Spencer," Ryan said carefully, struggling to balance respect for Margaret's service with resentment about her chosen absence from their family. Harper needed family support after Sarah's death. She needed to know that she wasn't alone in the world. Margaret turned toward Ryan with understanding that reflected her own struggle with the impossible choices between duty and family that had defined her career. "Mr. Spencer, staying away from Harper was the most difficult thing I've ever done, but my presence in her life would have exposed her to dangers that no child should face." Lieutenant General Bailey stepped forward to provide context that might ease the tension between family reunion and institutional obligations. Chief Spencer's assignments have involved counterintelligence operations in environments where family connections could be exploited by hostile forces. Her decision to maintain distance was about protecting Harper, not avoiding responsibility. Harper absorbed this explanation while studying her grandmother's face for signs of the family connections she had been seeking since her mother's death. "Grandmother, did you know about my shooting? About the training Mom gave me?" Margaret's expressions softened with pride that had been carefully hidden for years of watching Harper's development from a distance. "Harper, I've been following your progress since you first picked up a rifle. Your natural abilities exceed even your mother's exceptional skills." The confirmation that Margaret had been monitoring Harper's development created both comfort and confusion about the boundaries between family concern and professional surveillance. Harper realized that her weekend practice sessions at civilian ranges had been observed by someone who cared about her progress, but couldn't openly acknowledge the relationship that motivated that interest. Chief Spencer Colonel Phillips approached the family group with respectful formality. "We've prepared a private conference room where you can continue this reunion without interruption." Margaret nodded acknowledgement while maintaining her focus on Harper, whose composed demeanor impressed someone who had spent decades evaluating personnel under stressful conditions. "Thank you, Colonel. But I'd also like to observe Harper's marksmanship abilities firsthand before we discuss family matters." The request surprised everyone present, as it suggested that Margaret's visit involved professional evaluation that went beyond simple family reunion. Bialalai's expression indicated that this wasn't entirely unexpected, though the timing suggested institutional priorities that complicated personal relationships. "Grandmother," Harper said, with growing confidence about expressing her abilities to family, "I'd be honored to show you what Mom taught me." Margaret's response revealed the professional standards that had guided her career while acknowledging the personal pride she felt in Harper's development. "Harper, I want to see your technique and accuracy, but I also want to understand how your mother approached your training." As the group moved toward Eagle's Peak Range for the second time that day, Harper walked beside Margaret with obvious eagerness to learn about family history that had been hidden from her. "Grandmother, can you tell me about Mom's childhood? About how she learned to shoot?" Margaret's expression grew nostalgic as she shared memories that had been carefully preserved despite decades of enforced separation from family. "Sarah started shooting when she was 7 years old. She had the same natural eye-hand coordination that you've demonstrated, but she also possessed the mental discipline that separates good shooters from exceptional ones." The description of her mother's early training provided Harper with context she had never possessed about the systematic development of abilities that seemed almost supernatural to observers who didn't understand the dedication required to achieve such precision. "Did you teach her the same way she taught me?" Harper asked, seeking connections between generations of instruction that had produced remarkable results. "Some of the same principles," Margaret replied carefully. "But Sarah developed her own methods based on her understanding of how you learned best. Good instructors adapt their techniques to match their students' capabilities. Captain Mitchell had been preparing the range for another demonstration when he spotted the approaching group that now included Pentagon-level personnel, whose presence indicated institutional attention that exceeded routine training activities. "Chief Spencer, we have targets available at any distance you'd like to evaluate." Margaret studied the range setup with professional assessment that took into account environmental conditions, equipment quality, and safety protocols. "Let's start at the distance where Harper demonstrated her abilities this morning. I want to see her perform under conditions similar to what impressed the initial observers." As Harper settled into position behind the scoped rifle, Margaret observed her technique with the evaluating gaze of someone whose career had involved training elite marksmen under the most demanding conditions. The fluidity of Harper's movements and the precision of her equipment handling impressed Margaret, who recognized training methods that reflected Sarah's understanding of fundamental marksmanship principles. "Range is clear," Mitchell announced after completing his safety checks. "Targets are active at 300 meters. Harper's breathing settled into the controlled rhythm that preceded precision shooting, her entire focus narrowing to the coordination of sight alignment, trigger control, and environmental compensation that separated amateur shooting from professional marksmanship. The afternoon lighting created optimal conditions for long-range work, with minimal wind and excellent visibility. The shot that followed was preceded by absolute stillness that seemed to extend beyond Harper to encompass the entire range environment. When the rifle fired, the sound carried the authority of precision equipment operated by someone who understood its capabilities completely. Through her spotting scope, Margaret tracked the bullet's path to the target with professional interest that quickly transformed into amazement that exceeded even her expectations based on second-hand reports. Dead center bullseye, approximate deviation from point of aim, 0. The announcement created a moment of profound silence as Margaret processed the implications of watching her granddaughter demonstrate abilities that met the highest standards of military marksmanship training. Harper's performance validated everything Margaret had hoped to see while exceeding the standards she had established based on decades of training elite personnel. "Harper," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying emotion that had been carefully controlled throughout their first meeting. "That was exceptional shooting by any measure." Harper looked up from the rifle scope with satisfaction that came from demonstrating her abilities to family who understood their significance. "Thank you, Grandmother. I've been working to honor Mom's memory through maintaining the skills she taught me." Margaret approached Harper's position with obvious pride, mixed with concern about the institutional attention such abilities would inevitably attract. "Sweetheart, your skills represent opportunities that could shape your entire future, but they also come with responsibilities that extend beyond personal achievement." Before Harper could ask for clarification about these responsibilities, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sergeant Major Grant, whose expression showed the strain of having spent the afternoon preparing reports about his confrontational handling of the morning's events. "Chief Spencer, Grant said with obvious discomfort about addressing someone whose rank and Pentagon connections placed her far above his authority level. "I understand you've been briefed about this morning's activities involving Miss Spencer." Margaret turned toward Grant with the kind of measuring gaze that senior personnel used when evaluating subordinates whose judgment had produced questionable results. "Sergeant Major, I've read your preliminary report about the circumstances that led to Harper's demonstration. I'm particularly interested in your assessment of her capabilities." Grant found himself in the impossible position of having to defend his dismissive treatment of Harper while acknowledging that her demonstrated abilities had completely undermined every assumption he had made about her potential. "Chief Spencer, Miss Spencer's marksmanship is exceptional. My initial assessment was based on incomplete information about her training background. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise the reality that Grant had publicly humiliated a child whose abilities exceeded those of most trained soldiers. Margaret's expression indicated that she understood the full scope of Grant's behavior and its implications for his professional competence. "Sergeant Major," Margaret said with quiet authority that carried decades of command experience, "Pear's abilities aren't the result of casual training or natural talent alone. They represent systematic development of skills that require dedication, discipline, and exceptional instruction." Grant's discomfort intensified as he realized that his dismissive comments about Harper's fantasy soldier mother had been directed at the granddaughter of a Pentagon official whose career involved exactly the kind of specialized training he had mocked. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the Colorado mountains, Harper stood between her grandmother and the institutional representatives whose attention would determine her future opportunities. The morning's confrontation with Sergeant Major Grant had evolved into a family reunion and professional evaluation that would reshape everything she had understood about her place in the military community and the legacy she carried forward from generations of exceptional service. The decision briefing that convened in Colonel Phillips' conference room 90 minutes after Margaret Spencer's arrival brought together institutional authority and family dynamics in ways that would determine Harper's future within the military community. General Mark Steele Patterson had arrived unannounced from the Pentagon, his presence indicating that Harper's situation had escalated beyond routine talent evaluation into strategic planning that required senior command attention. Patterson's reputation preceded him into every room he entered. A career that had included Special Operations Command, Pentagon policy development, and the kind of decision-making authority that shaped military programs at the highest levels. At 58, he carried the gravitas of someone whose recommendations influenced defense budgets and training protocols across all service branches. Chief Spencer Patterson said as he reviewed the compiled reports and evaluation materials spread across the conference table. "Your granddaughter's demonstrated capabilities represent exactly the kind of natural talent our development programs are designed to identify and cultivate." Harper sat between her father and grandmother, feeling the weight of institutional attention that had grown throughout the day, from Sergeant Major Grant's mockery to Pentagon-level evaluation of her future. The formal conference setting emphasized that decisions being discussed would extend far beyond family preferences into systemic military planning. "General Patterson," Margaret replied with the careful precision that characterized her approach to balancing family advocacy with professional obligations. "Harper's abilities are exceptional, but any programs we consider must account for her age and educational development needs. Phillips had been observing this Heil discussion while managing her own concerns about base operations and command responsibilities that extended beyond individual personnel matters. Generals, we also need to address the institutional factors that led to this morning's confrontation. Miss Spencer's treatment by base personnel raises questions about our approach to civilian interaction and talent recognition. The oblique reference to Sergeant Major Grant's behavior shifted attention toward accountability measures that would demonstrate institutional commitment to proper treatment of all personnel, regardless of age or civilian status. Patterson's expression indicated that personnel issues were being evaluated alongside program opportunities. "Colonel Phillips," Patterson said, with a directness that characterized his approach to command decisions, "I've reviewed Sergeant Major Grant's report and witness statements about this morning's events. His handling of the situation demonstrates judgment failures that require corrective action. Grant had been waiting outside the conference room for the past hour, knowing that his career progression depended on how senior leadership characterized his confrontational approach to Harper's presence on base. The closed-door discussion would determine whether his actions were viewed as overzealous security consciousness or inappropriate harassment of military families. "Sir," Phillips replied carefully, "Sergeant Major Grant's actions reflected adherence to what he believed were appropriate protocols, though his execution showed poor judgment about proportionality and respect for military families." Patterson's response indicated that personnel accountability would be balanced against institutional learning rather than purely punitive measures. "Colonel Grant will receive formal counseling about appropriate interaction with military dependents, along with additional training on talent recognition and family support protocols." The measured approach to Grant's discipline reflected military culture that emphasized correction and education, rather than career destruction for leaders whose mistakes stemmed from misguided devotion to duty rather than malicious intent. General Ryan Spencer interjected with the respectful firmness of someone whose protective instincts demanded clarity about his daughter's future. "What specific programs are being considered for Harper? And what kind of timeline are we discussing?" Patterson opened a briefing folder containing program descriptions and developmental timelines that had been rapidly assembled in response to Harper's demonstration. "Mr. Spencer, we're evaluating several options that would provide Harper with advanced training while ensuring appropriate educational and emotional support." The programs Patterson described represented opportunities that exceeded anything Harper had imagined when she first asked to demonstrate her shooting abilities. Advanced marksmanship instruction, competitive shooting teams, and eventual pathways towards specialized military occupations that utilized precision shooting skills. The immediate recommendation, Patterson continued, involves establishing a formal mentorship relationship between Harper and experienced marksmanship instructors, beginning with weekend programs that supplement her regular education. Harper leaned forward with obvious interest in the practical details of how such programs would function. "General, would these programs take place here at Fort Valor, or would I need to travel to other installations?" "Initially, here," Patterson replied, "with Staff Sergeant Price serving as primary instructor and Chief Spencer providing periodic evaluation and advanced techniques instruction." The mention of Staff Sergeant Price brought Harper's attention to the woman who had defended her mother's memory and provided crucial support during the morning's confrontation. Having Price as a formal mentor represented both professional opportunity and emotional connection to someone who had known Sarah personally. "Staff Sergeant Price served with my mother," Harper said quietly, more to herself than to the assembled generals. She understands what Mom would want for my training?" Margaret nodded acknowledgement of the emotional significance of this instructor assignment. Harper Price is one of the Army's finest marksmanship instructors. Learning from her will honor your mother's memory while developing your abilities to their fullest potential. Before Harper could respond to this arrangement, the conference room door opened to admit Dr. Linda Rogers, whose presence indicated that psychological evaluation had been deemed necessary for assessing Harper's readiness for advanced military training programs. "Generals," Dr. Rogers said respectfully as she took her assigned seat, "I've completed preliminary assessment of Miss Spencer's emotional maturity and stress response capabilities based on observations of her performance today. The psychological evaluation represented a crucial factor in determining whether Harper possessed not just technical abilities, but the mental resilience necessary for advanced training that would place her in high-pressure competitive and operational environments." Dr. Patterson said, "With obvious interest in professional assessment that would influence program recommendations, what's your evaluation of Miss Spencer's psychological readiness for intensive training programs?" Dr. Rogers consulted her notes before providing an assessment that would significantly influence Harper's future opportunities. "General, Miss Spencer demonstrates exceptional emotional regulation, mature response to stress, and healthy motivation that focuses on honoring family legacy rather than seeking personal recognition." The positive psychological evaluation validated Harper's demonstrated composure throughout a day that had included public confrontation, family reunion, and institutional evaluation by senior military officials. Her ability to maintain focus and performance under such circumstances impressed evaluators who understood the psychological demands of advanced military training. Furthermore, Dr. Rogers continued, "Miss Spencer's approach to marksmanship reflects understanding of the ethical responsibilities that accompany lethal skills. Her training has emphasized precision and control rather than aggression or power fantasies." Ryan Spencer felt relief as he heard professional confirmation that Harper's training had developed positive rather than concerning psychological patterns. Sarah's emphasis on responsibility and ethical application had apparently created healthy attitudes toward exceptional abilities. Dr. Margaret asked, with grandmother's concern for Harper's overall development, "Do you have recommendations for ensuring that advanced training maintains appropriate balance with normal adolescent development?" Dr. Rogers' response reflected understanding of the complex psychological factors involved in accelerating talented young people through intensive training programs. Chief Spencer, Miss Spencer, would benefit from continued civilian education and social activities that maintain peer relationships outside military training environments. The recommendation for balanced development addressed Ryan's primary concern about military programs overwhelming Harper's childhood and normal social development. Hearing professional support for maintaining civilian connections eased his anxiety about institutional pressures. Mr. Spencer Patterson said, "Recognizing parental authority in decisions about Harper's future, these programs would supplement rather than replace Harper's regular education. We're talking about weekend training and summer programs, not military academy enrollment." The clarification about program scope helped Ryan understand that institutional interest in Harper's abilities didn't require immediate full-time military commitment. The proposed arrangement would allow her to develop exceptional skills while maintaining the childhood experiences he considered essential for healthy development. "General," Harper said with the directness that had characterized her approach throughout the day's challenges, "I want to accept these training opportunities. I want to honor my mother's memory by developing the abilities she gave me. The statement carried conviction that reflected careful consideration rather than impulsive enthusiasm. Harper's mature approach to opportunity demonstrated the kind of thoughtful decision-making that impressed evaluators who had observed many young people struggle with similar choices. Margaret studied her granddaughter's expression, seeing in Harper's determined focus the same commitment to excellence that had characterized both Sarah's service and her own military career. "Harper, these programs will be demanding. They'll require dedication that goes beyond weekend hobby shooting." "I understand, Grandmother," Harper replied with quiet confidence. "Mom taught me that exceptional abilities come with responsibilities to use them properly. I'm ready for that responsibility." As the formal discussion concluded with preliminary approval for Harper's entry into advanced training programs, Patterson gathered his materials while preparing to deliver final guidance that would shape the implementation of Harper's development. "Miss Spencer," Patterson said, with a kind of official authority that made his words carry lasting weight, "your demonstrated abilities represent valuable assets that the Army is committed to developing properly. These programs will provide you with opportunities that few people your age receive." Harper felt the significance of institutional recognition settling around her like a mantle that connected her individual achievements to larger purposes that extended beyond personal accomplishment. "Thank you, General. I won't disappoint the trust you're placing in me." As the meeting participants prepared to leave the conference room, Harper walked beside her grandmother toward a future that had been transformed from routine base life into exceptional opportunities that would honor her family's military legacy while developing her own unique contributions to Army marksmanship programs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Fort Valor as word of Harper's official recognition spread through base personnel who had witnessed the morning's confrontation and subsequent demonstration. The girl who had been mocked for wearing her mother's uniform was now officially recognized as possessing abilities that warranted Pentagon-level attention and development programs typically reserved for adult military personnel. Sergeant Major Grant stood at his office window, watching Harper and her family cross the base courtyard, knowing that his career had been forever altered by a morning when his assumptions about talent, respect, and military excellence had been proven completely wrong by a 12-year-old girl whose abilities exceeded those of most trained soldiers. 6 weeks after the morning that transformed Harper Spencer's life from routine base existence into Pentagon, recognized exceptional talent, Fort Valor's Eagles Peak Range hosted its first formal ceremony, honoring civilian contribution to military marksmanship excellence. The autumn Colorado sun illuminated gathering crowds that included base personnel, visiting Pentagon officials, and local community members who had followed Harper's story through carefully managed media coverage. Harper stood at attention beside Staff Sergeant Price, wearing a modified version of her mother's uniform that had been professionally tailored to fit her growing frame while maintaining the respectful accuracy that had triggered the original confrontation with Sergeant Major Grant. The silver name tape still reads Spencer, but additional insignia now reflected her official status as a junior marksmanship instructor trainee. The transformation in base atmosphere was evident in the respectful attention Harper received from personnel who had witnessed either her original demonstration or subsequent training sessions that had validated every positive assessment of her abilities. Soldiers who had initially viewed her presence with skepticism now sought opportunities to observe her technique and benefit from insights that exceeded their own training experience. Colonel Phillips approached the podium that had been established for the ceremony with obvious satisfaction about institutional changes that had emerged from Harper's situation. The morning's events had catalyzed policy reviews and training modifications that improved the base's approach to talent recognition and family support across all operations. "Ladies and gentlemen," Phillips announced to the assembled crowd, "today we recognize exceptional achievement that demonstrates the best traditions of military excellence and family legacy." Lieutenant General Bailey and General Patterson occupied positions of honor that reflected Pentagon investment in Harper's development and the broader programs her abilities had helped establish. Their presence indicated that Fort Fowler's experience with civilian talent recognition was being evaluated as a model for implementation across other installations. 6 weeks ago, Phillips continued, "This base witnessed a demonstration of marksmanship ability that challenged our assumptions about talent, training, and institutional responsibility. Today, we celebrate the positive changes that emerged from that challenge." Harper felt the weight of attention from hundreds of observers, but her composure reflected weeks of intensive training that had developed not just her shooting abilities, but her confidence in handling public recognition and institutional expectations. Margaret Spencer stood with Ryan among the family seating area, her presence no longer requiring the security classifications that had kept her hidden from Harper's life. The conclusion of her deep cover assignment had created opportunities for open grandmother relationships that were enriching Harper's development in ways that extended beyond military training. "Harper Spencer," Phillips said, gesturing for Harper to approach the podium, "represents the 4th generation of her family to serve Army marksmanship programs with distinction. Her abilities honor her mother's memory while establishing new standards for excellence." As Harper moved toward the podium, with the confident stride she had developed through weeks of formal training, she passed Sergeant Major Grant, whose expression reflected the complex journey he had completed from confrontational skepticism to grudging respect and eventual admiration for her achievements. Grant's formal counseling and additional training had transformed his understanding of talent recognition and appropriate interaction with military families. His written recommendations for Harper's program participation had been among the most supportive documents in her official file, demonstrating professional growth that validated the Army's preference for education over punishment in addressing leadership failures. "Sergeant Major Grant," Harper said quietly as she passed his position, "thank you for the training recommendations you provided to General Patterson." Grant's response reflected genuine respect that had replaced his original dismissive attitudes toward Harper's abilities and family background. "Miss Spencer, those recommendations reflected your demonstrated competence. You've earned every opportunity you've received." The brief exchange represented healing that had occurred through professional interaction and mutual respect rather than forced apologies or artificial reconciliation. Grant's acknowledgement of Harper's abilities provided closure that honored both his institutional role and her exceptional achievements. At the podium, Harper looked out over the assembled crowd with confidence that reflected not just technical proficiency, but emotional maturity that had impressed every evaluator involved in her program development. The silver wings around her neck caught the afternoon sunlight, creating reflections that seemed to connect her mother's legacy with her own emerging path. "When I wore my mother's uniform 6 weeks ago," Harper began, her voice carrying clearly across the range through the public address system, "I was trying to honor her memory on the anniversary of her death. I didn't expect to discover family I didn't know existed or opportunities I had never imagined. The audience listened with respectful attention as Harper acknowledged the complex emotions and institutional challenges that had accompanied her transition from isolated grieving child to officially recognized talent with Pentagon-level support and family connections that extended her understanding of military service. "My mother taught me that exceptional abilities come with responsibilities to use them properly and to help others develop their own potential." Harper continued, her words reflecting training that had emphasized leadership development alongside technical skill advancement. Staff Sergeant Price had been working with Harper on public speaking as part of her comprehensive development program, recognizing that formal recognition would require communication, skills that complemented her marksmanship abilities. The investment in Harper's overall development demonstrated institutional commitment to producing well-rounded contributors rather than narrow specialists. "The training I've received here at Fort Valor has taught me that individual excellence gains meaning through service to others and contribution to missions that protect people who depend on military competence." Harper said her mature understanding of service obligations impressing observers who understood the complexity of such concepts. Dr. Rogers, observing from the audience, noted Harper's continued psychological development and healthy integration of exceptional abilities with appropriate understanding of ethical responsibilities. The formal recognition ceremony provided additional evidence that Harper was managing institutional attention without developing concerning attitudes about personal importance or entitlement. Today marks the beginning of expanded programs that will help other young people discover and develop their own exceptional abilities, Harper announced, revealing information that had been carefully coordinated with Pentagon public affairs officials who understood the publicity value of Harper's story for military recruitment and community relations. The announcement of expanded talent identification programs represented Harper's most significant contribution beyond her individual achievements. Her situation had catalyzed systematic changes that would benefit countless other young people whose abilities might otherwise remain undiscovered or undeveloped. General Patterson stepped forward to present Harper with a formal certificate, recognizing her status as the youngest civilian ever to achieve instructor qualification in Army marksmanship programs. The recognition carried practical benefits that included access to advanced training facilities, specialized equipment, and mentorship from elite personnel. "Miss Spencer," Patterson said with official authority that made his words carry lasting institutional weight. "Your achievements honor your family's military tradition while establishing new possibilities for civilian contribution to Army excellence." As Harper accepted the certificate, she felt the culmination of a journey that had begun with grief and remembrance, but had evolved into opportunities that would shape her entire future while honoring her mother's legacy through service that extended beyond individual accomplishment. The ceremony concluded with a demonstration of Harper's current abilities, showcasing skills that had continued developing through intensive training with equipment and instruction that exceeded anything available through civilian channels. Her performance validated every institutional investment while providing inspiration for other young people considering military service. Corporal Morgan and Private Graham, who had witnessed Harper's original confrontation with Sergeant Major Grant, watched her demonstration with amazement at the transformation that had occurred through proper recognition and development of exceptional talent. Both soldiers had volunteered for additional marksmanship training, inspired by Harper's example and commitment to excellence. "She's incredible," Graham said quietly to Morgan as they observed Harper's precision, shooting at distances that challenged most experienced marksmen. "Hard to believe She's the same girl Sergeant Major Grant was laughing at 6 weeks ago. Morgan nodded agreement while reflecting on the institutional changes that had emerged from Harper's situation. Sometimes it takes something unexpected to show us what we're missing. Harper's situation taught everyone here about recognizing talent wherever it appears. As the formal ceremony concluded and crowds began dispersing across Fort Valor, Harper walked with her grandmother and father toward their family quarters. Her steps carrying the confidence that came from knowing her abilities were valued, and her future held opportunities that would honor her mother's memory through meaningful service. The evening sun painted the Colorado mountains with golden light that illuminated a military community transformed by one child's courage to demonstrate exceptional abilities despite institutional skepticism and personal attacks. Harper Spencer had evolved from a grieving daughter seeking to honor her mother's memory into a formally recognized contributor whose abilities would influence Army marksmanship programs for years to come. Margaret Spencer watched her granddaughter with pride that reflected not just Harper's achievements, but the family tradition of service that continued through each generation's commitment to excellence and contribution to missions larger than individual ambition. The silver wings that Harper wore carried forward a legacy that now included 3 generations of exceptional service and promising potential for continued family contribution to military excellence. Ryan Spencer felt the satisfaction that came from watching his daughter find her place within institutional structures that valued her abilities while maintaining the childhood experiences and family relationships he considered essential for healthy development. The balance between exceptional opportunity and normal adolescent life had been achieved through careful program design that honored both Harper's potential and her need for comprehensive personal development. As they reached their family quarters, Harper paused to look back at Eagle's Peak Range, where her journey had begun with public humiliation and had concluded with institutional recognition that exceeded her most ambitious dreams. The distance between those two moments represented not just personal transformation, but systemic changes that would benefit countless other young people whose talents deserved recognition and development. The silver name tape on Harper's uniform caught the final rays of afternoon sunlight, reflecting not just her mother's legacy, but her own emerging identity as someone whose exceptional abilities would be used in service to others and contribution to missions that protected the values and people she had learned to cherish through her military family's tradition of selfless dedication to something greater than individual achievement. Fort Valor's transformation from a place where Harper Spencer faced mockery to an installation that formally recognized her exceptional contributions represented the military's capacity for growth, learning, and adaptation when confronted with evidence that challenged existing assumptions about talent, family legacy, and the diverse sources from which excellence could emerge to strengthen America's defense capabilities. The end. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoy this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.